Given the state of current events, I'm kind of hard-pressed to write a joke to start the show and thank our newest patrons. I'll just say this. Every once in a while, you hear about someone who's actually dedicated their lives to helping the most vulnerable and marginalized in our society, and when presented with the chance to speak loudly in the presence of power, they don't waver. Our guest this week is one such person, and you, Gaytheist Manifesto patrons, are the reason these conversations get to happen every week. This week's conversation lifted me up and gave me hope, and I hope it does the same for you. You helped make this happen, and I'm forever grateful. This week's newest members of the family are Sam and Devin. Thank you, friends. Your source for news, commentary, discussion, and debate at the intersection of the atheist movement and the LGBT rights movement. This is the Gaytheist Manifesto. Hello, dear friends, and welcome to another episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto. I am your host, Callie Wright, joined once again by the fantabulous Ari Stillman. Ari, how are things?
Well, I forgot to come up with something clever to say because I was too busy writing my outro.
Oh,
Whoops.
Good. Well, that gives people something to look forward to at the end of the episode. Good stuff. It's a good way to set the tension.
What will it be? Ooh, it's a surprise.
So it's a safe bet that if I asked you to name what you think the most important jobs in our society are, teaching would at least be near the top of the list, if not at the top, right? There's obviously lots of like varied and super valid critiques of our education system in the United States. And at this point, there's like a daily political fight that uses teachers and students as political tools. And teachers are largely overworked, underpaid, underappreciated. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about how difficult a position we as a society shove teachers into. And then I ran across a story about our guest for this week. She is Mandy Manning, and she is the National Teacher of the Year for 2018. Mandy, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So can you start just by telling us about the sort of teaching that you do? Because it's not necessarily the traditional kind, I guess.
Yeah, so I teach in what's called the Newcomer Center at Ferris High School in Spokane, Washington. And the Newcomer Center is a specialized English language development program for brand new immigrant and refugee students to our nation. So the students have generally been in the United States for 3 months or fewer. They've not attended a high school in the United States before, and they have very little English. So we're their first introduction to being a student in the United States, and I get to be their first teacher.
God, that's awesome. And so, I mean, have you always wanted to be a teacher? Is there a particular story of like what made you decide you wanted to go into education, and in particular this kind of education?
Actually, I did not want to be a teacher. I set out to be a filmmaker. I have my undergraduate degree is actually in filmmaking. But after I finished film school, I had determined quite quickly that it didn't quite fit my personality very well. So I didn't really know what I was going to do. And I spoke with a friend who happened to be a paraeducator and working in a special education classroom. And he told me that their classroom was looking for another paraeducator and that I should apply. And so I did. And that was my first kind of taste of what it meant to work inside of a classroom. And it was working with special needs students in a designed instruction classroom. And it was quite wonderful. I also got to coach Special Olympics basketball, but I still wasn't sold. And I had already applied to the Peace Corps. So I went to the Peace Corps and I served for 2 years in Armenia. And during that time, I taught English. And so I kind of thought that it might be something that I wanted to do, but I hadn't studied education. I didn't have a teaching certificate. But then when I moved to Texas after the Peace Corps, I lived with my aunt and I was working with her at her little theater there. And after we ran a little theater camp that summer, she was like, "Mandy, you need to be a teacher. This is what you were meant to be." And so I said, "Well, I'll try." and I applied to some jobs, and even though I wasn't certified and I didn't have a degree, I got a teaching job, teaching theater and speech and debate. And from that first day in the classroom, it was clear that this it was really important. I was going to be able to have this huge impact on all of these young people with so much potential, and so I've just been doing it ever since. And I did finally get, of course, my teaching certificate, but, so yeah, 19 years later, here I am. And the reason that I'm working with refugee and immigrant students is partly because one of my colleagues here in Spokane encouraged me, but also because of my experience in the Peace Corps. It really opened my eyes and helped, expanded my worldview and broke down some of my personal perceptions. And I wanted to help and welcome these brand new people into our community. And so here I am.
So, and I feel like teaching is probably one of those things, like almost everyone gets into it for very idealistic reasons. And then, you get into something like that, and then you're kind of hit with what sometimes are like very political realities that don't have a lot to do with the reasons you got into teaching. And so like the specific kind of teaching that you do, I think it ends up putting you like right in the middle of two of the really like hottest political issues of the moment. Because, we have all of these teachers walking out across the country in protest of teacher pay and education funding. And then you have all of this really harsh rhetoric and harsh treatment, increasingly so, of immigrants and refugees in the U.S. And so, given that context, can you tell me what it means for someone like you doing the specific work that you do? Can you tell me what that means for you?
It means that I have to work extra hard to ensure that my students know that they are welcome and that they are loved and we're happy they're here, and that we want to help them to achieve their dreams so that they can be really productive members of our community. And it also means that I can't just go into my classroom and shut the door. I can't just focus on my students, but I have to focus on helping other people in the community and across the United States to see my students as future citizens, as these really focused, dedicated human beings who want to give back to our nation for having, inviting them in, and that they are focused and are so dedicated that they achieve their dreams. Most of my students graduate in 4 years and they go on to university and they want to become doctors and teachers and dentists and pharmacists. I mean, they want to do everything that we want to do. And so it's my job to ensure that the larger community sees them, welcomes them, and believes in them.
And I'm trying to think of a way to phrase this, that because I have to see the connection between someone like you being chosen in this particular climate, doing the specific work that you do. I mean, do you think there's a statement that's being, that someone's trying to make with that? I mean, if it is, it's one that I think is awesome and that I agree with. I think that's a good move. But, this gives you a huge platform to tell the stories of people who are largely not even just ignored, but who are the marginalized, and, people who are experiencing very, very harsh treatment by, certain sectors of our society at the moment. So can you kind of unpack that experience for me?
Well, so the Council of Chief State School Officers is the group that supports the National Teacher of the Year program. And they are a nonpartisan, non-political entity. So they work with the, superintendents in each state, just in advocacy and such for education. And so my being chosen is not intended to be a political statement. I think that inevitably it is because of what I teach, but also being chosen for this distinction is not just about who I teach, but it's how I teach and how I communicate about what I teach. And the fact that I don't only teach immigrant and refugee students. I coach basketball. I advocate for my students who are, LGBTQ+. I have been one of the outside of my classroom every single day. And I think that the National Teacher of the Year program is about being able to communicate and advocate. And that's what I do every single day. And so I don't think it's necessarily a political statement. It's about articulation and being able to be a strong voice for what's right and what is good in our schools.
Yeah. And I mean, ultimately, we would hope and wish that not need be a political statement, right? Like it should be obvious that like we want to include immigrant and refugee students and queer and trans kids and kids with disabilities and et cetera, et cetera. Like it shouldn't be a political statement. And so like, I imagine that's gotta be such a tough position to be in, because I mean, I imagine in your mind, it's like, I just see these kids with all this potential and I want them to live their best lives. And everybody's like, well, that's a bunch of liberal nonsense. You're like, no, it has nothing to do with that. Like, I just want these kids to live amazing lives.
Because advocating and accepting every person and wanting people to connect with those who are different than them should not be a radical idea.
Yeah.
Well, it shouldn't make me a rebel. Like it should be like, we need to be that way. We need to be seeking experiences that are outside of our understanding. Of course we do.
And while you being selected for this award wasn't necessarily a political statement, Callie failed to mention this, being a very bad host of this show. But people may know you from a recent headline that was circling around where, being...
That's my last question of the interview.
Presented with this award by President Trump. And many articles note that you did make some... silent, I suppose, political statements by wearing political pins on your jacket. For example, one that said trans equality now. And you also handed President Trump an envelope full of letters from your students, and you encouraged him to read those so that he could gain a better understanding of what it's like to be an immigrant and a refugee. Can you get into a bit about like what your thought process was, and maybe if you've seen things in the articles reporting about it that aren't necessarily true about what you were trying to say?
Mm-hmm. So I think, everybody's going to come to their own conclusions when they just watch something or read an article. But I don't think it should have been any surprise that I would be wearing, my rainbow apple and my trans equality now and my Dreamers and my Peace Corps pin for my immigrants and refugee students. I don't think that should be a surprise, considering I'm an educator who educates all students. And for me, I was not making a statement to, throw in the president's face. I was communicating to my students who saw me standing on that stage, who saw me in a house that maybe makes them feel marginalized or not very confident in their place in our community and in our society. And I wanted them to know without a doubt, I was there for them. I was there to share their stories, to ensure that they were seen and heard. And that was very important to me. It was important to me that my students understood, no matter what, no matter where I am, no matter who I'm with, I am here for you.
Yeah, that's so cool. And that's actually where I first heard about the story. Could you, would you be okay getting into some of what some of those letters say? I mean, I imagine, some of it's deeply personal stuff, so if it needs to stay private, that's okay. But I'm curious what was written in these letters, if you're able to share.
Sure. So for the most part, the letters were extremely positive. The kids really took this opportunity to share with the president who they were, why they were here. Some of them talked about the struggles that they went through to come here. One letter in particular from one of our students from Afghanistan, he related his journey from Afghanistan to Iran to Turkey and then to the United States, and talked about how difficult it was, what a extreme process it was for them to go through, and then the fact that they are here now, but they still have a brother who's waiting to come, and they've been told that it's going to be another 10 years before their family member is going to be able to come and join them. And so he wanted the president to understand that it is quite an intense process to come to the United States, and that they are so thankful to be here, and they just really miss their family members. It was the situations that they came through were very difficult and traumatic, and they just want to be together as a family. And several other students communicated who they were, where they were from, and their dreams and what they want to do to become productive members of the United States. So some of them talked about wanting to go to university. I have one student who comes from a nation in Central America, and he communicated that he hoped to have a pathway to university because he really wants to work in information technology and give back to the United States. Another student talked about being able to learn sign language here in the United States and how she struggled being a deaf student in Syria because she didn't have access to some of the education that she needed in order to be successful as a deaf person. And she was so thankful. She even wrote in there that she said, "I love you, Mr. President." And so all of them were so very, very sweet and kind. And there were a couple that talked about some of the more difficult issues, like a student from Africa, one of the African nations. She communicated how much she has struggled since the election because of some of the language that the president has used, and how that has given people the freedom or the feeling that they, the license to be, really cruel. She's been told several times to go back to Africa, and how she just hoped that he would take care with his language because he is a role model for other people, and whatever he does, people will emulate. And so they were just really heartfelt, sweet, amazing letters, just communicating that these immigrant and refugee students are human beings, and they have dreams just like everybody else. And they, if anything, they're more focused and more dedicated and committed to achieving their dreams and becoming productive members of our community. And the thing is that most of my students are refugees. And the thing that a lot of Americans, I'm finding, don't understand is that a refugee is not undocumented. Mm-hmm. They have come here through a process, a legal process, and they are more often than not, probably 95% of the time, within 4 years, they become citizens of the United States. And so it's important that we be welcoming and inviting and ensure that they, integrate into our society and are able to be, Americans right beside those born here.
Yeah, well, and I think that, that kind of goes back to, when you're talking about you're wearing the pins, it's not necessarily a message for the president because, I think it's pretty obvious. We know that, regardless of what you say, you're probably not going to change his mind on things. But it's important to also know that you're talking to an audience whenever you do something that public. And so, what I just keep thinking, if, in a fictional world where I somehow get an audience with the president and I get a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes, what do I do? What do I say? And I think that's just sort of another brilliant way to just sort of because obviously, you do something like this, it's going to end up in the news, right? So your audience is not just the president. There's going to be news talking about this. And so I think it's also a really powerful way to signal yes, we are for you. We are here for you. But I do wonder, do you have, because obviously storytelling is a really powerful way to change people's minds. That's the thing that we talk about so much is we can get up in front of crowds and we can get on TV and radio and podcasts and we can throw out talking points and we can throw out arguments. But what really changes hearts and minds oftentimes is just telling people's stories. And so, I wonder, do you have hope that, that might actually change the heart and mind of someone who we may not have a lot of faith that could happen with?
Yes. I have to have hope that's going to happen. And that if I continue to tell these stories and share my students and give them a platform to share their own stories, that it will change the hearts and minds of people, particularly in those in positions of power. And it's not just for me. I have to hope that because I love my students. Mm-hmm. But I also have to hope it for them because they there is an innate hopefulness in immigrant and refugee students. They've been through things that we in the United States can never possibly ever understand.
Oh, yeah.
Yet they are committed and focused, and they have these incredible positive attitudes, and they're so resilient, and they have hope. And so I have to have hope that things are going to be different. And I believe that they are going to be different. I really do, because I believe in the United States. I believe in the citizens of the United States, that we do want to be welcoming and inviting and loving, because that's where we came from.
For sure. Yeah. And I wonder, because you brought up a lot of these kids have been through things that, they go through these things as small children that, adults here could never possibly imagine. And I wonder, is it difficult to keep students engaged in the sort of day-to-day of education? Like, given where they come from and given the political climate in the country, like, I imagine like it can be tough to stay focused. Like, how do you navigate that?
Well, when I have the students, because I get them when they very first arrive, they are so excited to be here, and they grasp every single opportunity to learn and to become, part of our community. And so I don't necessarily see kids, their hope diminish. I do know later, as they get older, it depends on the student, of course,
sure,
and it depends on their personal situation. Whether or not they can see a future for themselves. Because one of the things that we always think is that, oh, it's so much better here, they should be thankful and happy. The thing is that when they come here, they're very excited, but there's a whole new set of difficulties that come with coming to the United States, because many of them are, their parents have, college degrees, are doctors, are teachers, are all of these really, professional careers. But when they come here, we don't always recognize that. It just depends.
Mm-hmm.
And so then they're faced with finding work doesn't match what they've been doing their entire life. And then just the difficulties of navigating our systems and finding housing and going through the drudgery of just living. And so it just depends. It depends on the success they find, the welcome that they encounter, different things that to see if they, can stay focused. And majority of the time they do. I mean, our English language learners, our kids, who are coming from other nations, tend to be some of the most successful students, because they are so focused and thankful and excited to be going to school.
Yeah, so a lot of it's more the sort of practical, like, well, I got to figure out how to find a place to live and a job, and navigating the the differences in culture and that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it can be very difficult.
Oh yeah, I can only imagine. So one thing that I've seen a lot in the discourse lately, especially around teaching and this fight over education funding and all of that, there seems to be this thing where people in power sort of try to pit students against teachers in some really gross ways. Like, we see commentary from politicians who they'll refuse to fund education, thereby hurting students, and then when teachers walk out and protest, they're like, oh, you're gonna hurt the kids because they're missing school. Like, the governor of Kentucky tried to blame protesting teachers, like, well, these kids are going to be sexually assaulted and they're going to be introduced to drugs because teachers missed one day of school to come to Frankfurt and protest. And yeah, and it just seems like this really vicious and despicable cycle where, like, you try to speak up for your own well-being and you're guilt tripped into saying that speaking up for yourself is hurting the kids you serve. Do you feel that sort of pressure? And if you do, how do you navigate that?
Well, the love we have for our students, the true, deep, caring, unconditional love that we have for our students, is often used to put us on a pedestal, but then to also vilify us. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
Because they know that we love them, and we'll do anything for them. So they push us until we have no other recourse than to walk out. And then at the same time, when we do walk out, they make us feel guilty because they know how much we love the kids. And it is so hard. But the thing is that at the heart of every teacher is our students. We think of nothing more than our students. And sometimes the only thing that can make a difference for our students is coming together with a single voice. Our collective voice is our power. If it's just one teacher trying to say, hey, this isn't right, we need to do something different, you're just going to be ignored. So we have to be a force. We have to be a connected collective force in order to bring about any change. And I think we're seeing that in droves. I mean, so many states are doing this now because that's the only way to make change. And people can continue to say that we're hurting students by walking out. But as far as I'm concerned, and as far as what I've seen, the only way to help students is to walk out sometimes, because no one's going to listen to us if we don't.
For sure. And there was one story, I think it was in Oklahoma. I don't remember for sure. I could be remembering this wrong. But, there's so many news stories about these things happening. And then I read one story where there was a group of teachers who showed up to work to make breakfast for their students and pack lunches for their students because they know some students depend on their schools for those, students who live in poverty. So they showed up and did that to help their students and then went back to the picket line. And I feel like that was that was an afterthought in the news coverage. And that to me is the epitome of the argument, right? Like, you have people who are just absolutely dedicated at their core to being there for these kids. And I mean, at the end of the day, that's what it's about, right? Because I mean, teachers aren't going to be their best if they're not taken care of. So we have to take care of teachers to take care of kids. And it kills me that that's not the conversation.
Yeah. Well, in 2015 here in Washington State, we did a one-day walkout against the legislature because we were trying to fully fund education in our state. And on that one day, we organized childcare for the students. Many of the elementary schools provided food, ensured that the kids took food home the day before, all of those things, because we do know and we do understand and we know the gravity of what happens when kids don't get to come to school for a day. We understand that. And so we do that stuff. And I mean, it's just a matter of what narrative people want to believe.
Yeah, and it's a shame that those stories don't get more coverage because I think that is far more illustrative of who teachers actually are as people, generally speaking, than anything else on the news, because it's painted as a very selfish, self-serving thing.
Those
and it's
greedy money grubbers.
Right, because so many people are getting rich as teachers, right?
Yeah.
Well, Mandy, I want to say thank you first for the work that you do and taking the time to come on the show to talk with us about it. And as a queer and trans person, thank you for being so visibly for us in such a public way. Yes. Putting yourself out there like that, especially on a stage as big as that, can be a tough thing to do. And I mean, I've experienced a small sliver of how terrible the internet can be. And so
I'd say more than a small sliver. I'd say more than that.
But either way, we definitely appreciate you taking that step. And thanks for being with us on the show tonight. We appreciate it.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much for giving me yet another opportunity to speak on behalf of my kids.
Well, that, my friends, is going to do it for this episode of the Gaytheist Manifesto. If you think what we do here is important, please share this around to your friends. Search the Gaytheist Manifesto on Facebook and Twitter to find us there. I'm at Gaytheist Callie on Twitter. You can email us at podcast@thegaytheistmanifesto.com. And does Ari have a thing?
The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are solely those of Callie Wright and her guests and do not necessarily reflect those of their employers, patrons, or co-host, although in the latter case they usually do. The Gaytheist Manifesto is not meant to diagnose or treat any medical condition. Please consult your physician. Ari Stillman is not liable for any damages incurred as a result of this podcast. The Gaytheist Manifesto maintains a working relationship with the Cis Are Getting Out of Hand podcast and the SJW Circle Jerk podcast. However, this should not be taken as endorsement of any views or opinions expressed through these outside entities, especially the second one. For legal inquiries, contact Ari Stillman on Facebook or aristillman4@gmail.com. All rights reserved. Copyright 2018. Restrictions apply. See stores for details.
We are a part of the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative. We're a group of trans podcasters podcasting badasses working to bring more trans voices into podcasting and other content creation. Search the Trans Podcaster Visibility Initiative on Facebook for more info. If you want to support the show and the activism we do, you can head to patreon.com/thegaytheistmanifesto and make a per episode donation as little as $1 per episode. And if that's not on the cards, you can give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and share us around to your friends. It all helps and it all makes a difference. Before we go, I want you to know that if you're lost, you're hurting, you're scared, if you feel like no one cares and no one understands, you need to know there's a community out here that loves you, cares for you, knows that you're capable of amazing things and that you are worthy of love. If you're struggling, please don't be afraid to reach out. Until next time, friends, this is the Gaytheist Manifesto.